feel like I need a pause from Cantor Bill Sharlin to the beginning of my sermon, which is about a different musician at the beginning. No doubt you've heard of her, even seen her picture, and even if you're not a fan, maybe you've probably even heard some of her music, even an excerpt on the news. If you're like me and you spend time in the car with teenagers, you've heard a lot more. You viewed her in the headlines, certainly how she shut down Ticketmaster when the demand for her concert tickets went through the roof. Anyone here attended a concert? You know who I'm talking about? Taylor Swift, yes. And even if you've done none of those things, you've heard her name, Taylor Swift. The singer, songwriter, and incredible performer who has broken countless records, lifted economies, and been the talk of her town for her music impact and ticket prices in the year that just ended. Perhaps you also know that this year, Time magazine named her Person of the Year. Now, I have to admit, I didn't know a lot about her, other than the music I hear in the car with at least one of my children and some of the headlines. So I did some reading. And I'm always intrigued. Each year I go out to that great newsstand at Main Street and Chicago Avenue in Evanston, and one of the few news stores around. And I pick up the Time magazine at the end of the year. Terry, you're nothing. I'm always curious, who do they choose? And this year I learned how this began. In 1927, amidst a slow news cycle, Time magazine decided to choose a man of the year. Anyone know who they chose in 1927? I'll give you a hint. He had just made a very famous flight. Charles Lindbergh. The editors chose someone who, in their eyes, most shaped the headlines over the previous 12 months. And they have continued to do that, and as they add, for better or for worse. Time explains that the practice of making these determinations comes from what they call the great man theory of history, the belief that individuals have the power to transform society. And indeed, if you look back on 95 years of the Person of the Year, another issue, you do see many men. Some are great, others powerful, and historically, the choices of the magazine reflected patterns, as they explain. They reflected people who were rulers over traditional domains of power, and yes, mostly men. In the 95 years, there have been 14 United States presidents, 5 Russian or Soviet leaders, and 3 popes. Though we do have seen some changes over time. Anyone know who the first woman was? 1936. What's that? No, Wallace Simpson. I said they chose people who took the headlines, not always the people who they thought got the positive acclaim. And in 1999, they changed the language to gender neutral, from Man of the Year or Woman of the Year to Person of the Year. This time, they said they did something a little different, and I quote Time magazine. This year, they chose, and I quote, the person whose singular influence was revealed throughout 2023, who's held none of these traditional roles or anything similar. The magazine writes, every year contains light and dark. 2023 was a year with significant shares of darkness in a divided world. And they write, Taylor Swift found a way to transcend borders and be a source of light. They explain they chose Taylor Swift notably as the first Person of the Year to be recognized for her success in the arts. So no artists have been noted all these years. So why? Yes, she's produced and created more #1 albums than any other woman in history. Yes, she entertains and writes songs that connect people across boundaries. She's a symbol of generational change, and she's spoken out on issues important to her and impacted society. For example, when she got thousands of young people to vote by encouraging her fans to vote. Ultimately, though, Time explains that they chose Taylor Swift as Time's Person of the Year for building a world of her own that made a place for so many, for bringing joy to a society desperately in need of it. So after reading about Taylor Swift, I went through this other issue and read about the 94, I guess, other people that the magazine chose. Heavy on presidents, generals, and even dictators. 10 people were named twice, either alone or with others. 7 were United States presidents. 1 was a Soviet leader. 1 was a general and Secretary of State. Anyone? Marshall. Eisenhower wasn't the president. I guess he was actually a general, but he was named as president. And interestingly, Taylor Swift is in the list for the second time around. In 2017, she was listed in a group they called the Silence Breakers, the women who stood forward and were so active in creating the Me Too movement, calling out against sexual violence. A few years, they named science and medical professionals, for example, those fighting the Ebola virus. They named groups of women, standouts in 1975, corporate whistleblowers in 2002, and the silence breakers I mentioned. They named sort of generically named and unnamed revolutionaries, technology and environmental leaders, Hitler and Stalin. And in 1993, I was pleased to read, after shuddering reading Hitler and Stalin years earlier, they named the peacemakers. 1993. Anyone want to try? Who are they? You got to say it louder if you're saying it. Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin. Sadat was earlier, 79. Okay, Yitzhak Rabin, Nelson Mandela, F.W. de Klerk, Yasser Arafat. Again, this is who they named in 93. It's fascinating. And I learned that the Person of the Year issue indeed lifts up people who made the headlines for better or worse. As I mentioned, those for whom we shuddered and those for whom we thought, aha. Each year I read the magazine and I think about it. I think about who stood out in my year and why. For me, it tends to be people who act with kindness, who stand up for their principles, those who better our world, those who are present in a quiet and unassuming way, not looking for their own glory, but to be helpful, and those who teach me and challenge my thinking. As we begin this new year, this first Shabbat in the new year, we also begin a new book of Torah, Shemot, or Exodus. We're introduced to new characters in our story, our collective history. Pharaoh, threatened by the Israelites and going to enslave them. Shifra and Puah, anyone? The midwives who delivered the Israelite babies even when Pharaoh said kill them, the baby boys. The first recorded act of civil disobedience, I might add. Miriam, Moses' sister, who saves her baby brother's life. Of course, Moses, the shepherd who God appears to at a bush that's burning and says, go to Pharaoh, go to the people, get them out of Egypt. He also kills a man for beating an Israelite. And Aaron, his brother, who helps Moses lead, because Moses initially says, I don't want the job, I don't speak well, I can't do this, they're not going to listen to me. So this Torah portion, Exodus, is read for 11 weeks. If we use the Time magazine criteria of who claims the most headlines over those periods, or for the rest of the year, the Torah year, Moses would be our person of the year. He's the standout. He gets the most attention, right? At the end of Torah, what do we read? There has never arisen since Moses a prophet saw God face to face. So what do we see in Moses' life? He stands for his convictions, the taskmaster. He mindfully stops and attentively turns and notices the burning bush, which allowed God to speak to him. When he's offered the job of leader, he says, not me, with humility. But then he ultimately accepts and he agrees to take on the job, but with help. He recognizes his limitations. He goes before Pharaoh even when he's terribly uncertain and does what he knows is the job before him, and he seeks freedom for his people. He takes his advice. Many of you have studied the Torah portion Yitro, and his father-in-law gives him advice about delegating leadership. And later, as we know, he leads our ancestors for 40 years. He climbs Mount Sinai to get the commandments. He stands up for the people after they've made a golden calf and God wants to kill them all and says, no. Even though they committed idolatry, give them a chance. Later, he stands up for the daughters of Tzalafachad who say, we should inherit land. Our father had no sons and women, and he allows the laws of inheritance to change. And along the way, he lobbies for food and water for his people. He prays for healing for his sister. He makes mistakes. He loses patience. He acknowledges his weaknesses and he's punished by God. He's not allowed to enter the land because for what God believes is an act of lacking faith, for Moses it was probably a lack of patience. And ultimately, he graciously and gracefully passes on the mantle of leadership to Joshua, his successor. So as we look at his leadership, we see that Moses, like any other leader, he's complicated and imperfect. He grows in the position, he matures, and he errs. He certainly learns to communicate better. And when we look at the trajectory of his life and leadership, we can learn for our own lives. Whether we're people who make the headlines, maybe not quite Time Magazine, or we're people who sit quietly in our offices, our living rooms, our kitchens. We can learn to speak out. We can learn to advocate for justice, patiently encourage those on our team, be they our family, our work, our neighborhood. We can trust what we can do and ask for help. And of course, seek to better our communication always. As some of you know from studying with me over the years, I'm powerfully impacted by the teachings of presidential political scientist Fred Greenstein, scholar, author, and longtime Princeton professor who studied the psychology of the president. Full disclosure, also my uncle. And in his book, The Presidential Difference, Professor Greenstein, or Uncle Fred as I called him, challenges us to evaluate leaders through a list of criteria, hence the psychology of the presidency. His criteria are emotional intelligence, public communication, organizational capacity, political skill, vision, and cognitive style. When he does this, when he evaluates presidents through his presidents or any other leaders, he causes us and challenges us to look at them with new eyes. People we might not have liked come out better in other criteria, or people we might have liked come out not so great. So in this Shabbat, the first of Exodus and the first of 2024, I look at Moses, who's definitely the headline-catching leader, and I try to look at him with new eyes. What can I learn from him this year? At the same time, I look at my magazine and say, what can I learn from her this year? I look too to the midwives, Shifra and Puah, and other people in our history, in Torah and beyond, who don't even have names or headlines. Shifra and Puah are actually not named in Torah. But man, they kept our people alive. They actively defied Pharaoh's orders to kill the boy babies. They did this quietly without fanfare, and they acted on their beliefs. So if you look at the back of the, I'm really not advertising sales of Time Magazine, just by the way, but it's interesting. But if you look at the back of the Taylor Swift Person of the Year issue, you'll find a section called The Nation Builders, subtitled Israelis and Palestinians Who Stepped Up After October 7th. Among the people listed are Merav Roth, who trained hundreds and hundreds of therapists in dealing with trauma. Amir Hasnanian, civil defender, who searched for pieces of bodies and has done other things with tireless effort. Someone named Rita Tabet, who in Gaza has provided mattresses, housing, and shelter for people who need it. A night medic named Lana Okal, a peacekeeper named Amir Badran, and an organization called Brothers and Sisters for Israel, thousands of Israeli reservists who turned to do anything they can for good. Volunteers to work in hospitals, depopulated farms, and doing so many other things. Notice I said they were in the back of the magazine. Beautiful writing about them, I should say. These are people who are acting quietly and without fanfare, perhaps not unlike Shifra and Puah. So on this first Shabbat of the new year and this first Shabbat of Exodus, I invite you to look to the headliners and look to those who maybe we don't even know their names. Look to those who challenge and inspire you to do better, to make a difference, and to make our world a better place. Shabbat Shalom. And if you want to borrow my magazine, we turn to page 200.